And tonight's guest is Marilou McPhedran. I should throw in a quick disclaimer or disclosure here. I am part-time employed by Marilou, and it's really fun to call her Marilou tonight because in political circles, there's a lot of protocols and behaviors, and I often call Marilou Senator. Like Senator this, Senator that. We're talking to the Senator. Do you have any questions, Senator? What do you think, Senator? But tonight we're just going to call her Marilou because we're not talking tonight in our professional relationship. I'm here as the creative director of Unlock Democracy. Marilou is here as the representative of the people of Canada in the Senate. And we have so much to talk about. Every time we start one of these sessions, I think it's going to take an hour and a half, and it goes longer. But Marilou does need to leave tonight at 8:30 for another event, 8:30 Eastern. So hour and a half max. So quick rules of engagement. Feel free to post questions in the chat. Both Marilou and I will try and stay on top of it. We're going to have a little back and forth conversation prompted by a few questions that I've written down. Marilou has not prepared for this. She doesn't know what my questions are. There's no speech, there's no presentation. It's one of those like fireside chats without the fire, although I have a wood stove in the next room. Marilou, do you want to start with a quick land acknowledgement from where you are?
Yes, I want to begin by acknowledging and reminding that the Parliament of Canada is situated on the unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Peoples First Nations. I am a senator from Manitoba, which is generally known as Treaty 1 territory, and it is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And it is the origin of much of the parallel legal system. I think at this point, we really only have one law school in Canada that is teaching Indigenous law and Indigenous legal systems as part of the curriculum, and that's the University of Victoria. But it is a very well-developed area of not only laws, but also systems of law. And I want to include that in my acknowledgement.
Thank you. Awesome. I'm just responding to Tom in the chat and spelling things terribly because I'm Russian. So Marilou, what I would like to do over the next 40 minutes is first just talk a little bit about the Senate. I think it's a very mysterious place to a lot of people, and you're in it. So you're learning, every week you're learning new things about this mysterious place. I mean, because we don't elect the Senate in Canada, a lot of people literally don't really understand what it does. What is it there for? Is it just this weird remnant? Does it have a function? We'll dive into the details a bit about how people get into the Senate, which has changed in the last decade. And I think that's really cool. And I don't think most people know about that. And then we'll talk a bit about the different groups in the Senate, which is also so fascinating compared to the political parties we're all very aware of in the House of Commons. I think the Senate is just a really fascinating place right now. I didn't know a lot about it till I started working on Michael Chong's Reform Act 6 years ago, and we got that through the Senate. But now working with you, I'm learning even more. I'd like to talk about the Vote 16 bill, which you have in the Senate, but also any other bills you're working on or any issues that are close to your heart. And then lastly, I want to spend a few minutes talking about your career path. It's just a really mind-boggling, inspiring journey. And I think you probably have a lot of interesting thoughts to share about that. So is that okay as a kind of arc?
I very much trust in you, Dave, and I'm really happy to have this conversation. So I'll just go where you lead.
Okay, great. And to all of you, there's 45 of you out there now. Thank you so much for taking time out of away from your family or your TV or your dinner or your work to join us here this evening. This is being recorded. It will be available on YouTube. So just so y'all know. So let's start really, really broad, Marilou. Honestly, what is the Senate for? We don't elect it. It's, some people want to get rid of it. It's in party platforms that we should abolish it. We had Duff Conacher on, who you know very well. He was on 2 weeks ago. His organization, Democracy Watch, wants to scrap the Senate entirely. Maybe we could divide this up into two answers. What did you think about it 20 years ago, honestly, as someone who wasn't in it? Like, what were your thoughts about the Senate before? And now that you're inside it, what is the Senate now to you, to someone who's been a human rights advocate and campaigner for decades? What is the Senate of Canada?
It's a really wonderful set of questions, and I'll really try hard not to use too much of our time in answering. But in terms of the first question, 20 years ago, what did I think? Well, it's actually more than 20 years ago now. We're talking 30 plus years ago. My first substantive introduction to the Senate of Canada. And I need to tell you a little story. I, as you mentioned, have been a human rights lawyer and a human rights advocate since quite a young age. And one of the things that I did starting in high school and then carrying over into university as a young woman, so we're talking the 1960s and the early 1970s, was I worked on reproductive choice. When I was in university, it was illegal for me to go to a doctor and to be given birth control. And when I was in university, which was at the University of Toronto, there was a clinic that was run by a woman doctor, Dr. Marion Powell, at Women's College Hospital in downtown Toronto. And she defied the law of the land. We know, of course, also of Dr. Morgentaler in providing abortions, also defying the law, jailed as a result of that. And the law played a huge role in all of that, and government played a huge role in all of that. So I became actually very active, very, very active when the government of Prime Minister Mulroney decided that abortion should be criminalized, should continue to be criminalized, which was the whole crux of the Morgentaler cases, and introduced a new law in the House of Commons in order to do that. It passed the House of Commons. It made it to the Senate. And so as a result of that, I was in Ottawa lobbying senators. And what happened changed Canadian history, because women senators crossed their party lines, because in those days there were rigid caucuses with whipping and leadership. I always find that such an amazing word and verb, whip and whipping. And they just said, no, this issue is bigger than my party. And they came together and they met in different women senators' offices, usually at night. And I was in those meetings. And I was in the meeting where Mira Spivak, Lucy Pepin, Janice Johnson, senators that are no longer in the Senate, just basically said, we are going to stand up for the rights of women. And they were determined to defeat this bill in the Senate. And nobody thought they could do it.
Wow.
And they did. It was a tie vote, and therefore it lost. That's how close we came. That's how close we came to recriminalizing abortion in this country.
I didn't know that story.
No, most people don't appreciate the back channeling, and neither would I if I hadn't been sitting there with them. And it's a longer story sometime to tell you how they managed to get those votes. But yeah. I'll tell you something, I learned a lot about political arm twisting in those evening sessions with the women senators.
So on that particular issue, you were obviously pleased with the outcome. but at the same time, what were your thoughts about this unelected House overruling the elected House? Is that weird? Did you like what thoughts were developing in your head about our bicameral parliamentary process with one House that is just appointed? I mean, some people, I mean, there's such different opinions on it. And I've heard,
There are.
some people think it's so important that the people in the Senate aren't elected. That's what actually gives it its strength, that they don't have to always be campaigning and worrying about getting reelected. And other people say that it's a disgrace. How could we have this House that isn't accountable to anyone? So I'm just curious to hear, aside from that issue, and what an amazing story, and so sad that those fights even needed to happen. It's an embarrassment.
They still need to
And
happen.
that they're still happening. Um, did you have any thoughts about the unusual nature of having an unelected House in Ottawa?
I did, because I was a newly minted lawyer, and I had quite a strong interest in constitutional law. And I had accepted, though, the British North America Act, which then became rolled into what we know as the Constitution Act of 1982. And that's where the Senate comes from. And if we know anything about our Constitution in this country, we know it's incredibly difficult to change. So as a law student and as a young lawyer, I think I basically skipped over the accountability question and just stayed with, well, this is the state of the Constitution.
Right,
And it's not going to be something that can be easily changed.
right,
I would say in that 20 to 30 years ago, and I would say it's still true today, that I am a senator and I do my best to be a good and responsible and accountable senator. But I have always found that Duff's arguments and other people's arguments about the Senate not having sufficient accountability, I agree. To this day, I don't think the Senate has sufficient accountability. And I think there's tremendous scope for greater accountability and more transparency and accountability mechanisms.
yeah. And of course, as a voting reform advocate, I don't think the other House has accountability either. We often have governments, majority governments, that weren't elected by the majority of voters, which I would say isn't really accountability. So let's switch to the fascinating topic of how senators are selected. We all know that until recently, they were just handpicked by the prime minister, and the general feeling or mythology of it, or the unspoken truth, or maybe spoken at times, was that they were just friends of the party,
Mm-hmm.
fundraisers, failed candidates, whatever. And they were very clearly partisan. Everyone knew that. Liberals appointed liberals, conservatives appointed conservatives. Oh, Duff Conacher's entering the room. This should be fun. Hey, Duff.
Hi, Duff.
Thanks for joining us.
Duff,
So
I've already acknowledged your position on the Senate, and also acknowledged that it had some very strong, compelling arguments.
you just missed it, Duff. Just moments ago, she essentially endorsed your whole get rid of the Senate campaign. So I want to talk about how they've changed, how Justin Trudeau has brought in a reform. Technically, he still appoints, but there's a different process for how those names get to his desk. And most importantly, I want to then shift to how the different clusters sit in the Senate. But let's just talk about the process of how someone becomes a senator in Canada, and who better to ask than someone who's recently become a senator.
Thank you, Dave. I do have one little technical clarification. Senators are appointed by the Crown. They're appointed by the Governor General,
Yeah,
based on a recommendation from the Prime Minister.
right.
And again, I'll tell a brief anecdote just to illustrate the change in the process. So most of my life, I've grown up with the Senate clearly being a place of patronage. Now, because I've worked with a number of senators that were very substantive, dedicated strongly valued people, I certainly didn't dismiss individual senators or the overall function of the Senate. But there was no question in my mind ever that it was a patronage mechanism. And so my adult children, in the first year that it had been announced that there was going to be a different system, people could apply online, anyone over 30 could apply, and as long as they owned a very modest amount value of property in the province they wanted to be appointed from, as long as they didn't have a criminal record, and as long as they weren't bankrupt, they were eligible to apply for the Senate. So my adult kids called a family conference just a very short time before the deadline, and introduced the fact that they felt that I should apply for the Senate. And I explained to them at that family conference that there was absolutely no way that I believed that it was, in fact, an independent arm's length process, and that I was born and raised in Manitoba. I lived away for most of my adult life. And by the time we had this conversation in 2016, I had been back in my home province, living and teaching university there for almost 9 years. So I clearly qualified on that part. But I said to them, there isn't a big name liberal in Manitoba that would support me being in the Senate. I've basically pissed them all off at one time or another, and there's no way they're going to want to see me in the Senate. And my kids said, you said you'd do this, Mom, and we're going to do this. And my second born, who lives in other countries all the time, said, I'm not getting on the plane till I see you press send. So I was hugely pessimistic, and I can tell you that it really was an independent process. And I can tell you that the day that I got the phone call from the Prime Minister, I was shocked. And I can tell you who was even more shocked was those big name liberals, because I can tell you that they did not know. They did not know until it was in the news. And
Wow.
so I trust in the process now. And I think that the whole idea of having online applications, of having those applications reviewed locally by volunteers, they are volunteers appointed by an order in council, but they're not going to get rich from this process. It's very much community service. They then do their short list. They send their short list to the national committee. That is chaired by Huguette Lebel, who has been one of the most skilled and credible longtime senior civil servants for her whole career, and has tremendous trust and respect for her being a person of great integrity. And they shortlist, and the Prime Minister gets a shortlist, 5 or fewer names. And at that point, the Prime Minister makes a decision. And I'll just close this anecdote by saying, right after I got to Ottawa, I went to my very first International Women's Day March on the Hill, which was led by Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. And I went up and I introduced myself to her as a senator. And seriously, she looked at me with such shock. And she said to me, "You're a senator?" She said, "My husband appointed you to the Senate?" And I said, I was really kind of embarrassed. I said, yes. She said, "Well, that's amazing." She said, "I'm about to quote you in my speech." I said, "Oh, really?" And she said, "Yes, it's that quote where you said, never trust government to do anything for you." And so that's
Yeah.
kind of been the nature of the experience, where this is an old, deeply entrenched patriarchal system from beginning to end, completely designed to serve those who were considered to be of greater value, white, property-owning men. And that's still in its bones, in its DNA as an institution. So when we start talking about accountability and transparency, we are talking about an institution that is incredibly insulated against all of those kinds of goals.
Wow. That was an amazing story too. So here's the thing that I think a lot of people are confused about. I get confused about even as I'm learning it through working with you. When people get elected to a house, like the House of Commons under a party banner, we can see the tribes and clusters very clearly, especially with the party whipping that does happen. And when senators used to get appointed under a blue prime minister or red prime minister, they also created two very clear tribes. Harper, for years, didn't appoint anyone, created all these vacancies. And now they're all getting filled with independent senators who are coming through this new process. Without having the red and blue teams in that house, how are people forming into groups and clusters? And I'm curious, actually, how many senators at this point are from the earlier era where they came in under a pre-Trudeau prime minister as a blue or red, and how many have been appointed since? And then just talk a bit about the groups. Yeah, and
So for
you can mention your interesting personal interaction with the groups of recent times, or just give us a 101 lesson on how they work.
Yeah, well, I mean, that skirmish is a different topic in some
Yeah.
ways, and I think it's good for us to look at the current structure. Your description is absolutely correct about there essentially being two groups previously, and pretty much everyone belonged to their groups. There were a few exceptions. I'll mention one in particular because I've done quite a lot of work with her over the years, and that is the always independent Senator Lois Wilson, who was the first woman moderator of the United Church of Canada, and had to this day, I mean, I was just talking with her the other day about work she's doing with women in North Korea. And Lois insisted on going in as independent and insisted on staying independent. And what has changed from that, though, is that when Lois was an unaffiliated independent senator, basically all of the perks of being a senator, including sitting on a committee and being able to participate fully in the studies and in the voting on bills, were denied to unaffiliated senators. The system was so rigid that if you were not in one caucus or the other, you just kind of floated around and did your best because nobody was going to let you into their club and nobody was going to give you opportunities. That has softened in the way in which the grouping is now set up. Any senator can choose to be affiliated with a parliamentary group, of which there are currently 3. There's a threshold of 9 members that a parliamentary group must have before they can call on resources, research assistance, for example, that can be made available to all their members. And for a short period of time, there was serious discussion that there might in fact be an Indigenous senators group, because through the Trudeau appointments, there actually were enough Indigenous senators and are still enough Indigenous senators should they choose to do that. But of the current groupings, you only have the Conservatives that maintain a traditional Westminster model of a caucus with a leader and a whip, and basically you vote and you speak in the way that the caucus determines. That caucus is really the repository, if you will, of those who came in under the old system. There are also some former Liberals who came in under the old system, but one of the things that Justin Trudeau did before he became Prime Minister was cut those Liberals loose in a way that was very hurtful and created a lot of anger for many of those Liberals. They are now, many of them still acknowledging as card-carrying Liberals, but as senators, they do not have that affiliation. Now, as it happens, many of those folks, not all of them, but many of those folks formed one of the parliamentary groups in the Senate, now called the Progressive, the Senators Group. In addition to that, a number of Conservatives left the Conservative caucus and moved over to create what they called the Canadian Senators Group. And then you have the largest of the parliamentary groups, larger than the Conservative caucus and larger than the other 2 groups. And it was the first such group. It was founded by the now late Senator Elaine McCoy from Alberta. to whom I owe a debt of personal gratitude for her support and guidance. And when I became a senator in 2016, I was in the second round of appointments in 2016. Almost every one of the senators who had been appointed through that independent new process had opted to be part of the independent senators group. It now comprises almost 50% in and of itself of the seats in the Senate. There are still vacancies in the Senate. They are slowly being filled. And one, I guess, little clarification in your reference to Stephen Harper. Yes, it's true that Stephen Harper stopped appointing, but Stephen Harper, being the very effective politician that he is, regardless of whether I agreed with what he did, part of his effectiveness was he appointed a small but very loyal and very savvy, some might say um, vicious, but that's a point of view, of dedicated conservatives to make sure that what he wanted the Senate did, and that there was rapid passage. You don't see that now in the current Senate of Canada. You see bills taking much longer, you see much more in the way of questioning, and you see many more votes being distributed among the different parliamentary groups for or against a piece of legislation. I'll say on the record that I'm one of the senators listed as voting most often against government bills. But for me, that's on the basis of substance. And if I'm going to vote against a bill, I always speak and explain why it is that I cannot give my vote to that bill.
So, Marilou, one of the terms people use to describe the Senate is, the House of sober second thought. And we all know that the House of Commons does look quite the opposite, like a party of drunken men yelling at each other. So, and we all know that the committee process in the House of Commons, has been rightly criticized because of partisan, what's the word I'm looking for? Interference. So I've heard of stories both provincially and federally where people from different parties come together, try and work on a bill, but then in the end, the whips tell them what to do and all their work just gets thrown out. Do you feel that the Senate does create opportunities for that actual sober second thought? Is there genuine multi-partisan, thoughtful discussions that happen? And can you think of one or two examples where the Senate has taken a bill, revised it, and sent it back to the House in better shape than you got it?
I can think of many examples, actually, in the relatively short time that I've been there, which is just a little bit of over 5 years. I do, though, have to kind of draw a divide, and that is my first 3 years were pre-COVID, and COVID has changed so much. I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, for me, one of the most enjoyable and enriching to the legislative process experiences are the committees. And yes, there is, I think very often, not always, but very often, much more thorough examination and witnesses, the selection of witnesses. That's another whole topic. It took me 2 years to figure out how in some ways that system was rigged. I just couldn't figure out why nobody invited the witnesses that I submitted the names of, and finally figured it out. And now I have a workaround, I think, that produces some better results. But I'll use as an example, since you've asked for one, Bill S-3, which is the most recent legislation of a long line of legislation in Canada addressing the obvious, severe systemic discrimination in the Indian Act when it comes to the identification registration as a status Indian under the Indian Act for women and their children. And many people on this call will be familiar with the international human rights case, the first ever to come out of Canada on this very issue. And it was brought by now Senator Sandra Lovelace Nicholas. And it was brought by her as a single mother who tried to return to her home reserve to claim a home where she could raise her little boy. And she was turned away based on the Indian Act. Now, one of the things that we all need to bear in mind is that the Indian Act comes out of the 1880s, that the first Prime Minister of Canada also appointed himself in charge of the Indian Act and policies related to Indigenous peoples, and vicious policies under that law, and that legislation destroyed what at the time, prior to that legislation, roughly 80% of Indigenous communities in Canada were matriarchal in terms of governance, overall governance, and it shattered that. So these many different attempts to try to get to the root of this oppression that's created by this legislation, S3 was the most recent attempt, and it was introduced in the Senate, sponsored at the time by new Senator Francis Lankin, a former cabinet minister of the NDP in Ontario, a very thoughtful and effective senator, in order to make the adjustment. It was supposed to be the final fix, and it was entitled that it was an act to eliminate discrimination on the basis of sex in the Indian Act. So it was a big promise. Senator Kim Pate and I were even newer senators. We were both on the Aboriginal Peoples Committee. And before a bill gets voted on for the final time in either the House or in the Senate, it needs to go through a committee process. And there's some rare exceptions to that. And it needs to then come back and be voted on at third reading. So this bill was being put through Aboriginal peoples. As it happens, Kim and I were on a prison tour and we were trying to get back in time to the committee. Long story short, we rushed in, we were late. I had an amendment written on a napkin that had come from a discussion that we were having with Indigenous women leaders and advocates on our way back to the Senate. And I blurted it out, not knowing the procedure very well. And again, long story short, there was a mixture of votes on it, but probably just to make life difficult for the government, the Conservatives on the committee voted with Kim and I on the amendment that we proposed. And that set in motion many different iterations and blockages and standoffs around this piece of legislation, such that the Senate rejected. The Senate supported the amendment when it finally got through the committee. And even when the government basically said, we need you to pass this, the Senate said no. And what ensued was months of it floating around while all kinds of back channel negotiations occurred. And ultimately, and they came forward with another version, and we said no. And they realized they were going to lose the vote on the floor of the Senate, so they pulled it again, more back channel negotiations, until finally there was wording that was sufficient. It wasn't fully what the advocates wanted, but in that case, some of us saw ourselves in solidarity with the Indigenous women leaders, not other senators. And ultimately, largely through the very effective advocacy of Indigenous senators, led primarily by Senator Lillian Dick, who's now retired from Saskatchewan, and assisted in some of those negotiations by Senator Murray Sinclair, who's also retired, we ended up with, at least in the legislation, it is much, much further along in remediating. Our problem now is the lack of implementation of the law. You're on mute.
Another really fascinating one and very complex one that I wouldn't want to have been in your shoes is the medical assistance in death. What a complicated topic. And like, it's one thing to have an opinion on it, but to actually be a decision maker who's trying to balance different views and values and priorities. how did that feel? And can you tell us a bit about the role that the Senate played on that bill?
Yes, I can. There were some very important amendments proposed in the Senate that were accepted by the government, and that made it possible for that bill to become law. Uh, for the record, this is one of the bills that I voted against and spoke very strongly against, not because I'm against medical assistance in dying. I very much support the principle. Um, the previous version of the law that did become law was very much affected by Senate studies and if you will, sober second thought. And it was before I came to the Senate, but it was close enough in time that there was still commentary in media about this was one of the finest moments ever seen of the Senate of Canada and the kind of changes that were made to the first bill. Um, the second bill that came in when I was a senator, there were many good features in that bill, but I'm a human rights lawyer, and a lot of my work over the years has actually been with disability rights advocates and disability rights organizations. And when they reached out to me and said, we are being ignored, um, we are we are not being understood, in that it's not that we oppose medical assistance in dying per se, but we do oppose the way in which this version of the bill by this government has actually made it possible for many people who are living with disabilities. They've made it easier to choose death than to live a decently supported life. And it's the lack of resources that have not been addressed here. And they were not only a coalition of 90 plus disability rights organizations in this country. We have seldom seen a coalition of non-governmental organizations with such a high degree of consistency and agreement among them on a bill. And in addition to that, we had 3 of the UN international experts look at the bill from 3 different perspectives, from the perspective of seniors, from the perspectives of people with disabilities, and from the general perspective of access to healthcare. And all 3 of them concluded that the bill was essentially discriminatory in nature to the extent that it almost certainly was going to undermine the rights of people living with disabilities who were not wanting to choose death as their first choice, but rather were being essentially facilitated and pushed into that position because provinces and governments across this country did such an abysmal job of providing adequate supports. And the other person who spoke about the bill, there were a number of us who spoke against the bill, and there are a number of us who voted against the bill who didn't speak against it. But one of the other senators that spoke very strongly against the bill was Senator Mary Jane McCollum, my sister senator from Manitoba, and the only residential school survivor in the Senate. And she spoke very strongly against it because she spent a lot of time consulting with Indigenous organizations, Indigenous peoples living with disabilities. And they had many of the similar concerns. They were members of the coalition, but they had additional concerns from their perspective of Indigenous people living with disabilities. So that's an example where the bill went through, but there were, I think, the opposition to the bill was very thoughtful, and it had alternatives that were proposed, which the flow of the day was just not sufficient to have sober second thought actually pause the process.
Okay, wow. Before we get into talking about some of the issues you're working on now in the Senate that you're championing, we have an interesting question from Barbara Dilla in Charlottetown, PI, and it's around the question of if there's a bill in the Senate and you want to, as a citizen, express your support or opposition, who do you call, right? If there's something at City Hall, you call the mayor, you call your councillor. If it's in Ottawa, you phone your MP who represents your riding. How does an ordinary citizen should we find out who our provincial senators are and call them? Like, do you get emails from people in your province saying, I want you
Hundreds
to
and
vote this
hundreds,
way? I don't think people think
hundreds.
about the Senate a lot in that way. So what is the appropriate avenue for a citizen to engage with the Senate?
Well, I think there are multiple avenues, Dave, but for the most part, it's communicating either with the senator who is from your province, and or it's communicating to all of the senators, and or it's communicating to members of a committee that are going to be studying the bill, because that bill cannot make it back into the Senate for a final vote unless members of the committee, a majority of those members, approve it to go back into the Senate for a final vote. And it may come back amended.
So let me ask you, a very blunt question, not necessarily for your office, but your office and other offices. I mean, if no one's electing these folks, do they even read emails from constituents? I would imagine some do and some don't. There isn't a built-in mechanism to create that incentive, which some people see as a benefit, but other people would say, well, why bother writing them? Why would they even read my email?
Well, I think you're essentially correct that there is little or no accountability that is any kind of a lever to force or pressure an individual senator to answer communications. And I don't know this about all of my colleagues, but I can tell you that I don't answer all of the communications because I don't have the resources in my office to do that.
Right.
What we do is we try very much to identify when a communication has come, whether or not they agree with me, but when a communication has come from Manitoba, and we try to make sure that I'm responding to those for sure. And well, the other thing we see a lot of is an email that's going to all senators,
Hmm.
and often it will come from Manitoba, and I try to respond to those as well. But it is true that because we're not elected, there is lesser accountability. I agree with that premise.
Yeah, although there's so many safe ridings in the country that even that doesn't totally hold water. There's many MPs who don't have that accountability on their own. Um, okay, so thank you everyone for all still being here. I'm always less interested in how many people attend these, more interested in the how many people stick around rather than dwindle. I'd rather have 50 people stay for a full hour than start with 200 and see it shrink away. So thank you. We started with 50. We're still at 50. I want to shift now to some of the work you do. You're a hard worker. You have your own private members bills. You get very engaged on specific issues and pour your heart into it. Let's start with vote 16. That's the one I'm most familiar with. It's the bill you have in the Senate now and that you had before this session last year. And again, just to disclose for everyone, I am employed as a kind of advisor and organizer and assistant on this particular file. So I help the senator with her efforts to lower the voting age in Canada to 16. So I'm going to call you Senator for this part of the discussion, Senator. Senator, could you tell us a bit about why vote 16 is so important to you that you've put forward multiple private members bills on this issue? Of all the things you've worked on in your life, of all the things you could focus on, you've really put a lot of your energy behind this. Why?
This is the legislative priority of my time as a senator. If I survive that long, I have about 5 years left before mandatory retirement. I just turned 70 this past summer, and I believe strongly that this is a galvanizing and a reinforcing element of trying to revitalize and strengthen our democracy. And I can tell you, as someone who had the privileged option of being able to leave Ottawa after 2 days and nights of the insurrectionist convoy, I left. and lots of people didn't have that choice. But a lot of what I've been thinking about, both when I couldn't sleep for the honking, and also watched so much of the violence, which didn't, I'm not talking only about physical violence, I'm talking about a violent environment in the air. And I'm talking about just me with someone not knowing that I was a senator, trying to get into my office. I waited till 10 o'clock at night to try to get into my office. And it was, I mean, we were caught in the flow of the convoy. Um, uh, I was so inspired as a professor, as an educator, by my students, that the very first thing I spent money on as a senator was a consultation with young people. And that phone call I mentioned from the Prime Minister, he asked me, what is it that is going to be your priority? And I said, I want to bring Senate to the youth of Canada and the youth of Canada to the Senate. And so in that 2.5-day consultation, many of the young leaders that came were my former students, not all of them. But what emerged from that was, first of all, the leadership of Francophone youth in this country on the issue of lowering the voting age to 16. I learned a great deal from them about their perspective as Francophone youth from the margins, essentially, and started to think much more about what potentially the right to vote could be for young people between the ages of 16 and 18 from the margins who live in a range of different marginalized situations. And I also find it inspiring that we young people in our country can register 2 years. They can register their interest in a formal way with Elections Canada 2 years before they're eligible to vote. So this would mean that we'd have 14-year-olds able to indicate their commitment to exercise the right to vote when they came of age. And the more I thought about it, the more I became convinced, not that this would quote unquote save democracy, but when I watch what's happening on the streets of Ottawa, streets of Winnipeg, various cities across this country, and the level of ignorance, the level of not understanding at all what we're talking about in terms of a responsible government. Um, I really want to see more young people engaged younger. And there are many ways to do that. But I think voting at 16, the research now, which was not available, even 10 years ago was not available to verify this position. It's really, it's not unanimous, but it is very strong from a number of different countries, pointing out many of the stereotypes about young people voting that just are not true based on careful academically acceptable research from numerous countries. And we're really talking about 2 million young people in this country. So when some of my colleagues in the Senate talk about how disruptive this would be, that's not going to happen. You're not going to have, yes, we have about 1 million people associated in one way or another with the insurrectionist convoy that's going on right now. But that is a number that it seems to me that democracy will eventually sort this out with this approximate 1 million people in our country. The younger people can become engaged in our democracy, the research tells us that longer they will remain engaged in democracy. And the notion that they're all going to vote extreme left is actually not what the research indicates at all. Yes, some of them will favor extreme right and extreme left, so whatever that is. But you're talking about young people not being substantially different from older people. And every time I get this argument, which I get a lot, that, oh, well, they just won't think, they just won't. And I just say to them, have you ever campaigned? Have you ever gone door to door? I mean, I was 12 years old the first time that I campaigned door to door, and in a small town. So I knew who I talked to, and I knew what they told me, and I knew they lied to me. No, ultimately, when I looked at the numbers that came out, my father was the candidate at the time, so I kind of mattered to me whether people kept their word. Um, and so, to me, this is one of many initiatives that we need to be taking in order to strengthen our democracy, because Canada has, for the first time ever, with the 2016 census, become an old country. We have more old people in this country than we have young people. And we have to seriously attend to the highest possible level of engagement in our democracy.
So, how does this unfold now from a legislative point of view? You have a bill in the Senate, private members bill. I mean, I guess every bill in the Senate a private members bill?
No, so for example, when you had the S3 that I mentioned, that went to the Senate from the Government of Canada.
But it originated, every bill that originates in the Senate is a private member's bill, I would imagine.
No, it originated in the Senate as a government bill.
Wow.
So
Right,
yeah,
with that, of course.
just I'm sure most people know this, but any bill you see that starts with an S originated in the Senate. Now it may have been a government bill or it may have been a private member's bill. And yes, you're correct, Dave, in your impression that there are many more private members, senators' bills than there are government bills.
Right.
But the government bills, for the most part, are given priority. And are typically dealt with. If need be, they are given acceleration and special treatment to make sure that the Senate goes through a thorough process and returns the bill to the House of Commons.
Cool. I get to learn stuff tonight too. This is amazing. So you got a private member's bill in the Senate. Taylor Bachrach has a private member's bill in the House of Commons. Mm-hmm. So it's a race now. Who's no? It's
a friendly race. It's a friendly race.
It's an inter-legislative bicameral collaboration.
That's right.
And you're both hoping that one of you wins. And your last bill got to second reading, which was the first time that any Vote 16 bill in either house had reached second reading, which is great. For those who don't know, there's been bills on Vote 16 put forward for the last 15 years, supported by members of every party. But the first time we got to second reading and almost committee was the senator's bill last year. So how are you feeling right now about this new session? What can you share with our 50 guests about the likelihood of either of these bills moving forward? What are the obstacles in the way, and what can all these people do to help if they support this?
Well, let's start with the last. Tom's asking about which MP currently has the private members bill, and
I'll type it in.
It's Taylor Bachrach, who's NDP and is a new MP. And I'm really happy to say that one of the other two parliamentarians in the last session, Elizabeth May, and also Don Davies from the NDP. And Don has introduced bill after bill after bill for lowering the voting age. But the House of Commons has a lottery for private members' bills. And unless you get a number close to the top, you're never going to get a word spoken about your bill. And that was the case until this year. But for the very first time, there was a member of the NDP who got quite a low number in terms of proximity to the likelihood that actually there'll be a chance to discuss it. And that turned out to be Taylor. So Don worked with Taylor and Taylor picked it up, and he's a lovely guy and really working hard on this. And of course, what we know is that any bill that starts in the Senate has got to go to the House of Commons. Any bill that starts in the House of Commons has got to go to the Senate. So we see this as all win-win. And I also want to give just a quick shout out because Alexi is on. He's made a contribution, one or more, to the chat. One of the first members of my ongoing youth advisory committee to focus on Vote 16 was Alexi. Oh, good. Thank you for the spotlight. Who was in high school, who wrote what looked to me as a former university professor, a university level paper while still in high school about why we should be lowering the voting age to 16. I followed up. We had a talk much like this, and I asked him if he would join my youth advisory, and that's now, I guess, a couple of years ago. And I have amazing young leaders like Alexi who volunteer their time, are on my youth advisory. They choose for themselves their working groups. And I think it's fair to say the biggest working group is the Vote 16, but we also have a universal basic income, livable income group. We also have a climate justice group, which was an initiative of Alexi's. And we also have what they call themselves the Rainbow Crew on sexual orientation and gender identity rights. And the Vote 16 group of young leaders on my advisory do not come only from Manitoba. They come from many different parts of Canada. Plus, I have 3 internship positions for young people from Manitoba in my office, and all 3 of them are looking at aspects of Vote 16. One of them is in the Indigenous internship in my office, Katie McKenzie, who is looking specifically at the issues around engaging and the opportunities for Indigenous youth, because I made the point about Canada having become an old country for the first time, but that does not hold true for our Indigenous communities in this country. The majority of people in Indigenous communities in this country are young people. And so having a vote at the age of 16, even though there are many difficult questions associated with that in various Indigenous communities, there is tremendous potential there for also strengthening what we're already seeing to be very strong leaders, young Indigenous leaders coming from many different parts of our country.
Amazing. And I've posted a link there for everyone for the Senator's Youth Advisory Group, which is called the Canadian Council for Young Feminists. And Alexi's been doing great work, not just on our Canadian campaign, but he's become one of the key players in an international global network of Vote 16 advocates from all over the world. So yeah, thanks, Alexi, for all the great work you've been doing.
Sure. I mean, I would love to explain my own support, why I support Vote 16 if we have time.
Yeah, please, Alexi, do that right now.
Yeah, so as the senator mentioned, I did start this in high school. I had been involved in my own organization of Walkout Against Doug Ford's Cuts to Education back when I was in grade 10. Then I saw the beginning of the climate strike movement. And I realized that so many of these issues that are facing young people exist to the degree that they do because young people don't have a voice. And I'm sure there are a number of people here who have some skepticism, some doubt about the Vote 16 cause. That's totally fine. That's healthy, really. But what I really want everybody here to remember is that the vote is the institutionalized voice. It's the voice that can't be ignored. And in a country where, you know, the gig economy threatens to consume the young workers of our country, when suicide is the second leading cause of death for teenagers, when 1 in 5 Canadian children live in poverty, 1 in 3 if you're Black, 1 in 2 if you're Indigenous, when climate change is this ever-present looming threat for our young people, having a voice is a crucial thing. So of course, by all means, have your skepticism, have your concerns, but please remember the stakes that we're talking about when it comes to Vote 16. So yeah, that's how I've been conceiving of the issue lately. Thank you.
Wow. And there you go. That's my argument right there. That people like Alexi exist. And you know what? Alexi's right. Like there's the cynicism that some young people aren't ready to vote is true, of course, but it's so ridiculous because I know a lot of adults who aren't ready to vote. And almost any criticism you can direct towards youth, you'll find that those same examples apply at least to the same number in adults, if not more. One of the funny examples I'm working on right now as a marketing tool for the Vote 16 campaign is, people say teens are so stupid that they were all eating Tide Pods a few years ago. So I actually did the research and found the data of how many kids ended up poisoned in hospital from eating Tide Pods, which was almost zero, compared with how many adults ended up in hospital for drinking Lysol because their 70-year-old president told them to. So if you want to talk about which generation is poisoning themselves intentionally, it's not our teenagers, it's their parents. Anyways.
So Dave, on that point, I would just like to note on a perhaps lighter note, the source of that statement.
Yes.
I wonder if you might share with the rest of those of us here together just where that comes from.
Oh my God! If I knew you were open to that, I would have lined up the video. So one of the negative consequences of being a public leader, such as the senator, is that you become a target for praise and a target for anger, and sometimes the anger is more creative than other times.
And sexist.
And sexist. Oh, those go together so well, don't they?
Yeah.
And often. So someone made a video against our campaign to lower the voting age, depicting the senator as a witch, the witch, the wicked witch of the West in particular. And what they were trying to say is that clearly Justin Trudeau is behind this. So he's what role was he? Oh, no. It was worse. It was even better. Actually, in a way, it wasn't sexist because you were in charge and all the little monkeys were Justin Trudeau. So you were the puppet master. So you had the witch McPhedran sending off all these flying monkeys with Justin Trudeau faces. And the idea was it's a liberal conspiracy to take over the world. And of course, you the image resonated with you because of prior Halloween costumes, I believe.
Yes. I always dress as the witch at Halloween.
Right. So
yeah.
In this video, they were mocking the senator for being a witch and for having Trudeau monkeys, but also because she didn't know that all teens poison themselves with Tide Pods.
Yes.
The life of a senator.
And I think I just want to observe on that not as much on Vote 16, because I think there isn't the same opposition, but, I'm a very strong proponent of gun control and have been ever since the Montreal Massacre. And wow, those postings, and I see such a strong correlation between the people that have been trashing me and other advocates for gun control and the people that are part of the insurrectionist convoy in downtown Ottawa. A lot of that has to do with opposition to gun control. We know there are a lot of Americans in that crowd, and we know there are guns in that crowd. And so when we take something like Vote 16, it doesn't make sense to either think of young people as demons or to think of them as angels. Right. They are people. They are thoughtful for the most part, and they care. And why would we not want to do everything possible to increase their engagement and their caring about our country, to give them, as Alexi so aptly described, what is the generally understood and accepted strongest avenue for engagement in a democracy, being able to vote. And none of the research that's been run, for example, in Austria since 2007 indicates that young people are in any way going to significantly undermine the existing system of the democracy. We're really talking about enhancements, if you will, or clarifications for generations And that's a big part also of why it's my top legislative priority.
Great. And then now let's segue for about 5 minutes into other issues you're working on. And now I'll start calling you Marilou again. You're not just doing Vote 16. You've got your fingers in a few different issues. Just give us a quick snapshot of what's on your mind and on your desk.
Well, tomorrow, and I think Duff is still with us, so I want to give a shout out to Duff for all of the conversations that we've had now over many, many years on the question of corruption and lack of accountability in government. It's a very small part of that very big concern, but I'm on the agenda, whether I'll actually get a chance to speak tomorrow, but I will get a chance soon, if not tomorrow. I will be introducing an inquiry. It will be every single session that we've had since I became a senator, I introduce an inquiry into the self-governance and the ethics of the Senate of Canada. My essential position, without going into a lot of detail, is that it makes no sense for the Senate of Canada to have an ethics code that has less requirements for accountability and transparency and reporting than the House of Commons. And I would go further to say that there's a lot of room for improvement on the House of Commons side. And so what I will be introducing tomorrow with this inquiry, an inquiry is not a bill. It is an invitation to senators to think and to potentially, hopefully, speak on a particular topic. And so I always introduce, as soon as I can, an inquiry into self-governance, because the Senate is a completely closed circuit of its own governance. And there is a high degree of secrecy. And in the context of that self-governance, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does not apply to any senator. There's no law in the country other than the criminal code that continues to apply to senators inside that bubble of self-governance.
Wow.
I am of the opinion that that degree of secrecy and that degree of unfettered power is not a good thing, and that it's very important to keep shining a light, asking difficult questions. There was a skirmish a couple of months ago because I asked these difficult questions and offended one of the richest and most powerful male senators who complained. And there was a decision to commence a process to expel me from the independent senators group. In the end, I made the decision to quit the group because the process that they were offering was clearly not due process, and it felt like a sham. And I'm actually, to tell you the truth, feeling much happier and more myself being an unaffiliated independent senator. And I won't stop asking those questions.
And really, what could be more cool than being so independent that you get kicked out of a group called the Independent Senators Group? I mean, I don't know.
Ironic. It's true.
Badge of honor.
Mhm.
What was I about to ask? Oh, there was a question. Has anyone heard the term gray corruption? And there's a link that's been sent there. It seems relevant to some of the stuff you were talking about.
Thank you. I'll take a look at it, Barbara. Thank you.
Okay. And you've also been dealing, I know this just because you mentioned it in our meetings, that you're distracted with issues around Afghanistan and refugees and immigration. Is that related to a bill or outside work?
So I've been working with women from Afghanistan since from 20 plus years ago, the fall of the Taliban. And as a result of that, many of the women that I started working with 20 plus years ago have become friends. And so in July, when a number of them said to me, we're in big trouble and nobody's really believing it yet, but we think we're going to lose the whole country. I organized a letter to go to the Prime Minister, to go to our ambassador, Bob Ray at the UN, our ambassador in Geneva at the UN. And basically that letter said, can Canada please make sure we're stepping up to lead and that we're bringing a human rights and a women's human rights perspective to whatever it is that we're doing. Well, that's not how it turned out, folks. And so through August, I was working alone because I really, to try and be effective, and I need to be really clear about this, I have seen and I have been part of way more failures than successes in trying to get women out of Afghanistan alive. And I'm still doing it. A lot of that work has to happen at night because of the time difference. And it's just not reasonable to expect one's staff to keep pace that way. So I created a separation between what I've been doing on Afghanistan as an individual senator on my own, and then all of the rest of my parliamentary agenda that stays with my team, my parliamentary team. It just defies any kind of description other than to tell you that we have not distinguished ourselves in terms of implementing the promise that was made to the world, first for 20,000, then for 40,000. I continue to work on individual cases, and I continue to work with a network, an international network. My primary focus has been on women parliamentarians. I can tell you that over the last couple of nights, what we're now seeing is a shift by the Taliban. They are now starting to break into the homes, the places of hiding, very often not their homes. We know they've had lists for a long time. We know they've intercepted. We've had cases where they have impersonated Western NGOs and have left text messages or made phone calls saying, you have to meet us in an hour, we'll get you to the plane, we'll get you out of here. And then those women have turned up murdered. It was actually English-speaking Taliban that were luring them and trapping them. So it's become increasingly challenging, but a bottom line here that I really need to say out loud, all of these evacuations that are going on and all of these attempts at evacuations, they're not being done by governments. They're being done by individuals and volunteer and advocacy organizations without governments are not stepping up. Our own government has been very clear. You contact us when you get them out. Don't bother us when they're still in the country. So
Wow.
it hasn't been a time when I've really felt very good about, I mean, it's one thing we've made a promise to the world about 40,000, and I do believe eventually we may get there. But I can tell you that right now there isn't a sponsoring organization in our country that has any spaces to give. And the reason they don't have any spaces to give is because the second 20,000 promised during the election campaign that it would happen has still not been approved by cabinet. So the kinds of things that we're seeing on a day-to-day, night-by-night basis, the obstacles, and this is not about bad people being in our Immigration and Refugee Canada Department or in our global affairs. It's not about bad people. I believe it is about not very effective systems and not very responsive systems. So anyone who feels like asking their MP, asking members of cabinet, where are the second 20,000 spaces? Why have you not approved them and released them? Because they were a campaign promise, and so far you've not kept the promise.
Is there, no one has to take notes right now. I'm going to send out links and resources tomorrow to all of you, but Marilou, if you could help direct people to a web page or any information that they could use to draft a letter,
Yes,
that would
thank
be
you,
great.
Barbara. Barbara's listed Canadian Women for Women Afghanistan. And
Perfect.
then in addition to that, I think this is mostly an Ontario crowd, although not exclusively. The Afghan Women's Organization is actually a sponsoring agency. When these spaces get released, they will get more spaces. So that's another source. And then for general information about resettlement, both conceptually and implementing it, I want to give a shout out to my sister Senator Ratna Omidvar and Professor Wendy Sukur, who revitalized what used to be Lifeline Syria, and it is now Lifeline Afghanistan. It's not a sponsoring agency, but it's like a clearinghouse, and they have a lot of really good information on their website.
Wow. Is there a financial way people can support these groups? Is that something in need right now?
Well, what we need is, if remember how when we did this kind of miracle of 45,000 plus Syrians coming to Canada in a matter of months?
Yes.
Well, a lot of the reason that that happened was because in Canada, we have the best developed hybrid system, if you will, where groups of private citizens can come together and actually sponsor a family. And we need to have a lot of the rules around that relaxed. They're far too stringent. They don't need to be like that. So that's another topic of discussion with your member of parliament, especially if they happen to be in the cabinet. Um, but when I can say, when I'm trying to help someone get out of Afghanistan, when I can say to my contacts at the IRCC, hi, I need time with you. I need to tell you about this person and this family. And yes, we think we're going to get them out. Don't know exactly when, but when we get them out, we've got private citizens in Canada who've gathered the money. Some of them are relatives who already made it to Canada. Many of them are not. And that seems to help. Partly because you have people stepping up and taking responsibility, and it's not all being left to the government. So this is anecdotal on my part. I am so not an expert in this, folks. I'm just doing what I can. But this is something that I've learned. I really think it helps where you've got what's called a private sponsorship group, and the information about that is quite good on the Lifeline Afghanistan website, which I think Barbara or Dave have already posted.
I want to apologize to everyone. We're not going to have time for questions just because Mary Lou's got so many amazing stories. I want to hear more. We only have 3 minutes left.
Just let me see if I can push this back.
Well, okay, if you can, that'll be great. I want to ask a question now for the 13-year-old who's watching, which is Kate's 13-year-old. We'll just give you a second there. You're texting. I don't want to interfere with your schedule.
No, it's about Afghanistan. It's an international organization that's been working on this, but you know, they understand.
It's up to you. You still have everyone's still here, which is great. Yeah. But you did tell us when you needed to leave, so it's up to you. But there is one more question I do want you to answer. Yeah. Your life is an incredible story. You've worn a lot of different hats and worn them well, might I say. You've had an academic background, the Dean of University of Winnipeg Global College, an activist background, human rights, youngest lawyer to be named a member of the Order of Canada. I know you hate hearing all this bio stuff, but it's real and it's fascinating. You've also created a lot of very influential organizations and institutions. Co-created, co-founding the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, known as LEAF, METRAC, which is a women's advocacy group that deals with issues around violence against women and children, the Gerstein Mental Health Center in Toronto, which is such an important place. And now you're a politician. So I think it's really rare and valuable to have someone who's seen the world through the eyes of a lawyer, of a nonprofit leader, of an activist, and now as a politician. What can you share with us grown-ups, in terms of just life lessons, but also there's some younger people on the call who might be thinking of their career. Just tell us what it's been like being Marilou McPhedran.
It's been really messy. It's been really messy, and it's been really uncertain. And when I get invited to go back to various law schools to talk about my quote unquote career, I just say right up front, I wouldn't recommend to anyone that, I mean, I didn't ever really have a plan. What the one consistent factor that defines pretty much everything that I have tried to do. I got 15 more minutes, by the way, for this call, this next meeting. I have tried to live my values. And here's another little anecdote. A number of years ago, I was sued for libel by the Ontario Medical Association because I criticized them in the Globe and Mail newspaper in an op-ed piece around the sexual abuse of patients. And I questioned how little they did. It said they may sue me again if I repeat it. But I had amazing lawyers that stepped up to defend me. The case went on for more than 6 years. We ended up at a draw the night before we were going to trial, and that in itself is a whole story. But I remember at one point, my wonderful, wonderful lead lawyer, who had not been paid, by the way, for 3 years, just kind of shaking his head and saying, you're impossible. You're an impossible client. Surely, as a lawyer, you understand that you have to make compromises and that sometimes you just have to do what you don't believe in. And I said, I've never done that. As a lawyer, I've never done that. And he said, well, that's just ridiculous. I mean, that's just lawyers. That's just not what happens with lawyers. And it was a very difficult moment because I was really, really difficult for him to try and represent. And I'm so grateful for the 6 years that he gave to the case. And eventually he was paid, but he had no way of knowing whether that was going to happen. And I think in the end, it comes down to looking at yourself in the mirror. And sometimes compromise is a good thing. Sometimes you can very much live your values and compromise. Certainly in the world of politics, it's essential. The skill of reaching consensus, the skill of being able to move forward, the skill of knowing when it's possible to melt on something without compromising your core, that's really an important part of this, because if we're not willing to make certain adjustments in order to move forward on really important changes, then I think, and I say this about myself, I think more than anything, it's my ego. I think more than anything, it becomes this entrenchment around this grandiose notion of how somehow my stuff is more important than anybody else's. And I mean, maybe occasionally that might be true, but most of the time, no, it isn't. It is very much part of being able to live together and work together and build together to be able to find common ground. And usually that means everybody's got to give a little.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. So thank you.
Thank you.
We do have time for questions. I think I'm on top of all the ones we've seen so far. There were a whole bunch about voting reform, voting systems.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Proportional representation, a version of it, gotta have it.
Yeah. I don't want to get into that tonight, but obviously I'm on board. I know the senator's on board. Any questions about vote 16, about the Afghanistan stuff we were talking about, or about anything else that's come up? Don't be shy. Senator, any plans to run for prime minister? Well, no one can run for prime minister, although what's his name? Pierre, he was like, I'm running for prime minister. That was his branding this week. I was like, I don't think you can do that in Canada. But yeah, are you attracted to the other house, to having your name on a ballot?
No, I've been asked actually by all parties at various times in my life to run. And No, it hasn't. I mean, for me, the biggest gift, and it really is a gift, is that I've been able to carry over a lot of what I did as a human rights educator and professor into my work as a senator in a way that I would never be able to do responsible to a full constituency, and with, maybe 18 months or maybe less, maybe a little more, to be able to try to get stuff done. Being a member of parliament is one of the hardest jobs in this country, and I have enormous regard for people who choose that form of public service. I have, in some cases, a high regard for many of my colleagues, not necessarily all of them. And I believe that the more we can shift towards seeing the Senate as a full-time, fully responsible position, the better. That's not the way it started. That's not the way a number of senators still see it. It's very much part-time to running their businesses and sitting on corporate boards, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that where we need to go as a country is exactly where probably just about every single person on this call is already placed, in terms of what you care about, what you put your time and energy into, who you support, the kind of accountability that you're really not just asking for, but really demanding as essential. And we aren't going to improve unless we make a lot of those systemic changes.
Right. I wonder if there's ever been a case where someone went from the Senate to the House. Like, has there ever been an MP who was a former senator?
I don't know. Certainly the other way around, and certainly
yes.
Prior to the change made by Justin Trudeau, numerous senators have been members of cabinet over the years.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Ahmed wants to know when you expect the next, I assume, federal election to happen.
I have no idea. I am so not in anyone's inner circle. I have no idea.
Hopefully not for a while, because I know that one thing that's very frustrating for Marilou and anyone working on private members' bills is that every time an election is called, most people don't know this, but every bill just dies. They evaporate. Even in the Senate, we're not electing a new Senate, but the bill that we talked about before, S209, that Marilou got to second reading, past second reading, doesn't exist anymore. Even though there was an election for the House of Commons, every Senate bill evaporates every election. It's very frustrating. I don't know why that rule exists. It's a huge setback for movements who spend years and years working on building political capital and building alliances, multi-partisan collaborations, and getting bills forward. And then they all, dozens and dozens of bills just go, they die.
I mean, I'm on the list, whether I'll get to speak, but I've requested to be on the list tomorrow to reintroduce, to speak to S201 and to get us back on track to getting to committee.
Great, yeah. S201 is the new S209. Alexi just sent me a direct message with a great idea. Should we encourage these folks' children to join up with the CCYF or Vote 16 Canada? And we heard before, I think it was from Kate, someone said they've got a
that would be great.
Excited to vote now. Everyone here who knows anyone who's, forget about 15, 16, 17, I really want to get 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds involved with this campaign, because the problem with getting someone who's 16 to get excited about Vote 16 is that 2 years later, they're not really our target demographic anymore. They're actually allowed to vote. They're 18. So we have this like really nightmare scenario where our core target demographic ages out of our campaign constantly, very quickly.
Yeah.
So anyone, if you know anyone, any eloquent, passionate, energetic youth between the ages of 12 and 18, send them to vote16.ca and also to the Canadian, or sorry, Marilou, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the Youth Advisory Committee, or Alexi, or both of you, the CCYF? How many senators have created their own youth advisory boards. Why did you decide to create it in such a formal structure with a name and a logo and a website? Tell us how that's working out.
Well, I'll tell you that it came directly out of that first meeting in January 2017 of the young leaders that I asked to help me make a 5-year plan. And it was a top priority. And yes, it certainly was influenced by the Francophone young leaders who were part of that. And they, after it was maybe about a year, they came back to me and said, we would like to have, I mean, we're your advisory, we understand that, but we would like to have our own title, and we suggest it should be the Canadian Council of Young Feminists. They said, you told us that our primary purpose in being youth advisors was to build bridges with parliamentarians. And that's what we want to do. And we want to be able to identify ourselves. And they were the ones who said, we want to say feminist in the title. That's an interesting choice, which I supported. I'll also just share with you that there's been a lot of pushback by the administration of the Senate, which actually runs the Senate, by the way, folks. It's the full-time civil servants that really have tremendous influence, and they have been really questioning the existence of the title. So I don't know whether talking about compromise, I don't know whether we'll be able to keep it for that much longer. We'll absolutely keep the youth advisory. There are a number of senators who have some youth advisors. To the best of my knowledge, in terms of the kind of structure and the investment that my team and I make in recruiting student advisors, in trying to create opportunities that they very much define as priorities for them, I don't think there are many senators. And I know for a fact that there are very few senators that have the number of interns that I have in my office. The only other senator I know who has as many is Senator Kim Pate, and we work together on a number of issues.
Cool. Mark Henschel just mentioned that there's a charter challenge happening to get rid of first past the post, but there's also a charter challenge to lower the voting age to 16. So our movement right now is kind of three-pronged. We're in both legislative houses with private members bill, and there's a judicial branch campaign happening, which you can link to from our website, vote16.ca. But do you know anything as a Vote 16 advocate, but also a lawyer? What are your thoughts on the constitutional challenge to lower the voting age?
I think it's excellent, and I mean, we've been working quite closely in the past couple of years with Cheryl Milne and the group that have brought this, and also Sarah Austin for her children's rights organization. And here's the thing: it is simplistic, but a lot that gets created by legislation, including the injustices that get created by legislation, you need legislation to fix it. And bringing a judicial challenge, it's a challenge to the law, and it's been very carefully developed. And just the process of having a carefully prepared, thoroughly researched set of arguments that will be carefully considered by a decision-making body that we have placed some trust and credibility in, because the independence of our judiciary is a very big part of our democracy. So we're really engaging many different parts of our democracy, and by doing that, I believe we're strengthening our democracy.
Amazing. What a perfect note to end on. I can't thank you enough for spending an hour and a half with us this evening. More than that, I can't thank all of you enough for sharing your time with us. For those of you who wanted to hear about voting reform and proportional representation, we've got lots of sessions coming up with people who are from those specific campaigns. This is the third episode of a year-long series. I've got all your emails now, so you'll be getting updates about upcoming events. I'm going to share with you a link right now to our Patreon. If you want to support the work we're doing at Unlock Democracy, which includes lowering the voting age municipally and stuff like that, supporting the senators' work, but mainly working on changing voting systems themselves to give people more choice at the ballot box, more women getting elected, and other marginalized groups, and having more civil discourse. Check it out. You can make a monthly contribution of any amount you want, and it supports this speaking series and all of our advocacy. Senator Marilou, thanks for everything you do. It's so inspirational. In office, out of office, advocate, lawyer, shit disturber, independent politician that's so independent, even the independents can't work with you, at least can't
No.
control you.
That's an
Sorry.
important distinction. Thank
It
you.
is. I think we're all looking forward to seeing what
Yeah.
you do now as an independent, a real independent senator, and actually showing for both of these bills, both you and Taylor, I've been very impressed by your commitment to build multi-partisan, multi-party, multi-group support for your bill and his bill. And I think together we can show people that politics can be thoughtful, meaningful, compassionate, and you know, mature and nice. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And if I may just say, people have been posting lovely messages. They've also been posting highly informative messages. Thank you for that. But mostly, you know, you've been saying thank you, Senator, or whatever. Thank you. It's been an amazing time to have this time with you, because I know that what's behind the fact that you took the time to be part of this tonight is a deep commitment to strengthening our democracy. And I'm just so grateful. Thank you so much for giving your time and your attention tonight. Thank you.
Great. It's 8:45. I'm going to let you go and deal with that other very important issue you're working on.
Okay.
And
Thanks, everyone.
thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye for now.
Take care.